Moving on to the last chapter of the novel then, chapter 6 is the shortest chapter of all. Obviously we've got a circular narrative. The book starts and ends in exactly the same place. George warned Lennie in chapter 1 that if he was to get in any trouble, he was to come back to that exact place by the stream in the brush and wait for George. And obviously this is what Lennie's done now in chapter 5, and obviously George finds him in chapter 6. Before George's entrance, Lennie has two separate visions. Okay, if you remember, they're not actually real. Lennie is kind of imagining these in his mind and he's speaking in their voice then, and that's what we read. Now, this can sometimes become quite confusing for pupils. These are just two visions that Lennie have, and he imagines these two things kind of telling him off, okay? So it's in his own voice. He imagines firstly his Aunt Clara coming to him as a vision in a gingham apron, so like a checked apron. A traditional housewife, Mrs. Aunt Clara was, if you remember, and she kind of tells Lennie off first. Then Aunt Clara disappears into his brain, and then he imagines a gigantic rabbit telling him off, and almost repeating the words that George would say to him, because of what he's done. George then enters, and obviously Lennie's worried that George is now going to give him hell for what he's done to Curly's wife. Exactly the same kind of pattern as we've had with him before. George gives Lennie hell. Lennie says he's going to go off and live in a cave and be on his own, and then he gets George to tell him the story of the dream farm. George, usually apologises, feels guilty, and then goes into telling the story of the dream farm. However, this time is slightly different. Obviously, Lennie's taken this one step further, killed Curly's wife. That dream is no longer attainable, and nothing's ever going to be the same again, is it? And obviously this builds then to George's killing of Lennie, shooting of Lennie, the death of Lennie in this chapter, just before George has recounted the idea of the dream farm to him. Slim and the others then enter this chapter. Obviously Curly very keen to kill Lennie himself. George is obviously still in a state of shock about what he's done, very much just still looking at the hand that had the gun in for the whole time, and not saying very much at all. And then there's Slim at the end of this chapter who reassures George that he had no other choice, and he's the only one, once again, he's the voice of reason, the only one to show any kind of understanding of what George has had to do, and the understanding of Lennie's behaviour and so on. And then obviously the last line in the novel goes over to Carlson. What do you suppose is eating them guys? And we've got to think about obviously what happens next then for each of these characters. So at the start of chapter 6 now, obviously we've got the description of the setting, which is what we've had in chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 4 and chapter 5, okay, where we move to different settings. Now you'll recognise this is the same setting as we've got in chapter 1. So the book starts and ends in the same place. So this makes it a circular narrative. So that's the structure of the book, okay? Now this was foreshadowed to us from the start anyway. George says to Lennie that if he gets in any trouble, he needs to come back to the brush, and that kind of gives us a sense of inevitability that Lennie is going to get into trouble, and foreshadows the fact that he will and have to come back to this place in chapter 6. So it goes in a full circle, okay? So we've got foreshadowing there for a theme, how we foreshadow future events, and we got us back in nature as we were then in chapter 1, okay? And obviously the nature is really important, and we'll come to that in a moment. We got the reference to the light again in this chapter, which is the same as chapter 1, the same as chapter 2. It's incredibly important. We've got it at the start there. Already the sun had left the valley to go climbing up the slopes of the Galaban Mountains. So the reference to the sun there being personified as climbing up the slopes of the Galaban Mountains, makes the sun almost sound like it's trying to make an escape there by climbing out. And again, perhaps telling us that the lives of these men are very difficult to escape. They are incredibly isolated, just as isolated as the setting is. Remember, the bus driver, who said this about 2 or 3 times, will not go up to the ranch to drop them off. It's an incredibly isolated setting, as is, where they are in nature as well, and they end and start in the same place. So these lives of these migrant workers, where we think of context there, is incredibly isolated, and there is very little escape or change for these men. That's why we don't have very many different settings, and the setting is quite restricted, as well as the lives of the characters, okay? So we've got the setting in chapter 1 here now, with the brush being very peaceful and tranquil and calm, and as a bit of a sanctuary for George and Lennie, away from the harsh work that they're going to have to partake in on the ranch. So In chapter 6, they're in the same setting again now, so Lennie comes into the same setting first, but it has changed slightly. It's got more of a sinister, like predatory edge to it that it didn't have really in chapter 1. We saw a heron trying to, kill its kill a fish in the first chapter, and it was unsuccessful in its task because George and Lennie came down the path and disturbed it. But by chapter 6, this has changed. You can see in the description there, in the second quote, a water snake glided smoothly up the pool and twisting its periscope head from side to side. A motionless heron, the beak glanced down and plucked it out then by the head, and the beak swallowed the little snake while its tail waved frantically. So obviously this time the bird was successful in killing the water snake. So we've obviously got the reference to death immediately at the start. So there's obviously a foreshadowing here now for Lennie's death in this chapter. So we've got a foreshadowing there, the death in nature, obviously reflecting the death that's about to come with Lennie. And then you've also got the fact that the description of the death of the water snake there, waving his tail frantically, links quite closely with Curly's wife's death, Curly's hand being crushed, the way he was frantically, terrified and fear-stricken of Lennie. And then you've also got Curly's wife as well, feet battering the ground, screaming, hoarse cry to try and get away from him. So it's a similar kind of description, and all these things have obviously happened in the build-up now to chapter 6. So that might give us a reason why the snake gets away in chapter 1 and then doesn't then by chapter 6. Okay, so you've got the reference to the light again, the light climbing out to the valley, exactly the same as I said for the first quote. But the snake and the heron there, okay, might make us think as well of the weak versus the strong. I've said this before, okay, so weak and vulnerable characters like Lennie, like Crooks, like Candy, like Curly's wife, versus the strong characters like Carlson, like Slim, like the boss, like Curly. So we've got obviously these two sides, and the weak characters tend to be overpowered by the strong. And again, you've got the same thing going on in nature. Obviously, Curly's wife, being isolated, vulnerable, ends up dying at the hands of Lennie, and you've got Crooks, the way he's treated, and Candy, and so on. So the weak versus the strong kind of is seen in nature here as well as with people. So you've got the themes there, and you've got the context links too. Before George enters the scene, we have got the description of Lennie's visions. So this can sometimes, like I said, confuse pupils in exams and so on. This has come up as an extra question before. But Lennie has two visions before George appears. So it's important that we remember that they're not actually real characters. They come out of Lennie's head, and Lennie speaks their words in his voice, okay? But obviously, these characters that he kind of imagines are obviously really important to him, okay? So the first one then, the first vision he has is of his Aunt Clara. Now, you'll see in the picture there, the cartoon picture of the kind of a larger lady with a apron around her waist, okay? And she, as it says there, she's a little fat old woman with a gingham apron with pockets that was starched and clean. So I've said this before, Aunt Clara is our kind of stereotypical housewife. That's what we would imagine, kind of during that era, taking on this nurturing and motherly role, which is what kind of the traditional role that women should have had in that era, okay? Now, obviously, she was a significant character for Lennie. She helped bring Lennie up, and obviously, before she died, then George took over that responsibility. And it's important that we see that Aunt Clara, and then it is references to George when she's talking, kind of show us who are the important characters in Lennie's life. So it's definitely going to be his auntie and George as well. And obviously the second vision he has then is of this gigantic rabbit telling him off then. And obviously rabbits are at the centre of Lennie's dream, Lennie's idea of the dream farm. So all he wants to do is tend the rabbits. So the rabbits symbolise the dream for Lennie. And obviously that's an important figure for him as well. So you've got the auntie, the George, and the rabbits. But it's important that we compare the rabbit here in chapter 6 with the rabbits in chapter 1. Now, the rabbit imagery, the animal imagery was used in chapter 1 to describe the rabbits, and they were grey sculptured stones in chapter 1. who scurried away and got disturbed by George and Lennie when they were coming down the path. So they were very cute, the playful little rabbits in chapter 1, and they're the rabbits that Lennie kind of is obsessed with tending to throughout this text then when he thinks of the dream farm. But by the time we come to chapter 6, the rabbit that he imagines now is a gigantic rabbit that's come out of his head. So this could be a bit of a symbol here for the dream that's gone so terribly wrong for Lennie, okay? So obviously the rabbit is an extremely important figure for Lennie, but in this sense shows how the dream has gone wrong, and it's almost, you know, this grotesque, horrific figure that comes out of his head and is swearing at him and cursing at him, and completely changed from the vision that he would have had of the rabbit throughout the text. So he's been told off by his auntie, in his own words, and he says there, "You do bad things." So there's never a reference, even from the telling off of the auntie and of the rabbit that he imagines. There's no reference to actual murder or what he's just done to Curly's wife. He just says, you know, it's just saying you do bad things. Well, this is more than a bad thing. So again, this just makes us think of Lennie's mental disability and how he doesn't really understand the consequences of what he's done. He has no understanding at all. He hasn't got that, you know, the emotional intelligence to see what he's actually done, and what the consequences are, like I said. And you know, there should have been support put in place for Lennie to be able to deal with the disability that he's got. And we know that in the 1930s that wasn't available to him. He would have just been locked up. You know, in our day now, in the modern day, there is a support system in place, and people would be able to get educated about people with these kind of mental illnesses or disabilities. You know, people would be provided with housing, be provided with, you know, independence to be able to live with their conditions. But Lennie hasn't been given any of that, and obviously it was inevitable that he was going to end up in some kind of trouble, really. He goes on to mention the nice things that kind of George does for him there through his aunties, obviously imagining his auntie telling him it. When he gets a pie, he gives you more than half. He could have such a good time if it wasn't for you. So he's repeating George's words there from chapter 1, the easy life that he could have if Lennie wasn't around. You know, George means the world to him. He looks up to George, and obviously he remembers everything George says, doesn't he? Okay. Then he says you'll stick around and stew the bejesus out of George all the time. So he's kind of recognising George's frustration there with him. And then the rabbit then comes out of his head and says, 10 rabbits, you crazy bastard, you ain't fit to lick the boots of no rabbit, and so on. You're even crazier than usual. So terms like crazy bastard, like I said, these are repeated words. You know, he's got these words from other people. That's what he's been called, obviously, throughout the years. George calls him this himself, which is quite offensive, and a definitely offensive terminology to refer to somebody with Lennie's kind of issues in this era. But this was to be expected. Lennie doesn't know any different either, does he? Okay. So obviously, you know, if you see what Lennie deems fit for his punishment, Lennie's punishment is that he's not going to be able to tend the rabbits because he's killed someone. Obviously, the punishment for murder is going to be a lot more than just not tending the rabbits. So you've got this real childlike understanding of what he's done, and no recognition, like I said, or any remorse for the crime he's committed, really. Okay, so you've got dream there as your theme, okay, the idea of this dream farm and so on, tending the rabbits. You've also got the friendship between George and Lennie that comes out of this, and how much Lennie thinks of George, and then obviously the mental disability there for Lennie and the American dream. Now, one of George's lines, Lennie's lines, sorry, to George is always, you know, you're going to give me hell, George, when he's done something bad. And he says, I've done another bad thing. Again, this phrase, bad thing, to describe killing Curly's wife, you know, again, no recognition of what he's done, like I said. But he gets a different response from George this time. You know, George is usually very angry and frustrated and hot-tempered with Lennie, extremely impatient and fed up. You know, we saw that in chapter 1. We've seen that in other parts of the text as well. This time is different. He's gone a step further, and George kind of has resigned himself to the fact that he is going to have to kill Lennie himself rather than Curly do it, and so on. So he says to him, you know, it don't make no difference this time, okay? And then he says, hey, you're going to give me hell, and, you know, tell me like you've done before, George. And George sort of says to him, you know, you can't remember anything, but you remember every damn thing I say, and so on. You know, he's got this real responsibility for Lennie, and I think that comes across here, and he's the one that is now responsible for ending Lennie's life, isn't he? Okay, so he's been asked by Lennie to repeat the same kind of story that he has done in chapter 1, in chapter 3. This is what kind of reassures Lennie. And Lennie relies on hearing this to kind of make himself feel better. So just like a child needs telling off by a parent, it's like Lennie needs to be told off by George in order to be made to feel better. So you can see George's response there. He said woodenly. So you've got the adverb woodenly to describe the way he says it. So, would as in, he's quite stiff, he's awkward, he lacks any real emotion here. And you can see that with the description of his voice as well being monotonous, and with no emphasis at all, okay? Because obviously the gravity of what he's got to do is weighing on him, isn't it? So he just says, if I was alone, I could live so easy. So he doesn't really believe this story tells to Lennie over and over again now, and that's why there's not so much emphasis in his voice, but as well the reality of what he's saying, if I was alone I could live so easy, is going to strike George here. He is going to be alone, and he is going to be without Lennie. So you've got the reference to him stopping then, and then he stopped again, so he has to stop himself because he can't finish the sentence. Showing how emotional he actually is. We got the theme of friendship that comes through really strongly in chapter 6. George loves Lennie, cares for him, and obviously is really struggling with the decision that he's made here and what he has to do at the end of the text. So you've also got obviously the context, Lennie's mental disability again, and this heavy responsibility that George has, and the lack of support that George also has to deal with Lennie and Lennie's issues during this time, which would be a lot different for carers and people who were looking after people like Lennie in today's society. Okay. Lennie asks George to tell him, like you've done before, exactly the same as chapter 1, exactly the same as chapter 3, when Candy was overhearing them talk about the dream farm. But in this part of the text now, it really is just like a fairy tale. It's no longer a reality, if it ever was one for them. It's more like a fairy tale story that Lennie's being told almost just before he goes to sleep, and in this case it's the final memory and image he has in his mind before he dies. So George says, guys like us got no family, ain't got nobody in the world that gives a hoot in hell about them. So, we know that George and Lennie are different from the rest of them. And, he really does kind of show us the context of the time, the life of the migrant workers who didn't have anyone who gave a damn about them. Nobody cared. They were very lonely and isolated, like I've already said. And obviously the American dream there for the migrant workers is to have this little place. And as George says, we'll have a cow and then you will get to tend the rabbits. So the common migrant workers' dream there, American dream, is alluded to, as we've heard in the past. But we obviously got a theme of dreams again, this lasting kind of dream, the thing that makes Lennie the happiest, that Georgie repeats to him here at the end. And then this really strong friendship that comes between this two, and this big responsibility that George has had here now to obviously kill his best friend. The death of Lennie then. So George's last words to Lennie before he shoots him there: I never been mad, I ain't now. That's the thing I want you to know. So he wants to reassure Lennie. He wants, these kind words to be the last thing he hears before he dies. Just like you would want to reassure a child that they haven't done anything that's that bad, and we would want to make them kind of settled and calm. That's exactly what he wants for Lennie just before he dies. So he raised the gun then, steadied it, because he's obviously trying to compose himself. He's shaking there with the weight of what he's obviously got to do, and he brought the muzzle of it close to the back of Lennie's head. So the position in which he shoots Lennie mirrors Candy's dog, the death of Candy's dog. So Carlson shot Candy's dog in the back of the head to make it painless and quick. And this is exactly what George does. So we do see the friendships mirrored there as well between George and Lennie and Candy and his dog. And it's Candy's words that we remember from chapter 3 that obviously have resonated with George. He says, I oughtn't to have let no stranger shoot my dog, George. So Candy felt that it should have been his responsibility to have killed the dog himself. The dog was his responsibility, and they've been obviously companions for years, exactly like George and Lennie have been. So it's George that kind of takes it upon himself now and feels that it's his responsibility to take care of Lennie and kill him himself, rather than allow him to be killed, you know, or tortured and abused by Curly and the men when they come. So we can see obviously Lennie jarred there. The crash rolled up the hills first and rolled down again, so the men would have been able to hear the gunshot going off. Lennie jarred and settled slowly forward to the sand and lay without quivering. So it is a painless death, very, very quick, and Lennie wouldn't have known very much about it. And then George's reaction then is to sit stiffly on the bank, looking at his right hand that the gun had thrown away. So he can't believe you know what he's done. Essentially, he's in a state of shock. He's just looking at his hand and obviously trying to come to terms with the fact that he's killed his best friend. Curly comes bursting through. Then he comes through first and says, yeah, right in the back of the head, and he's quite satisfied with the fact that he's dead. He's happy, he's pleased that it's over and done with. So we've obviously got the themes again, underlying violence throughout the text anyway, in different forms, but obviously in this case now through the shooting of Lennie. We've got the death of Lennie here, lots and lots of death in different forms in this text as well. Death of animals, death of Curly's wife, and then you know, death of Lennie, and then in a metaphorical sense, the death of the dream farm as well. You've also got context comes into here. We mentioned the justice system on previous slides. So it's just the lack of justice in America during this time. You know, the justice system was clearly flawed. The fact that George can just shoot Lennie and there aren't any repercussions for his actions. You know, there wasn't any evidence that that was Lennie that did that to Curly's wife, yet George is able to shoot Lennie and not receive any punishment for that. And if George hadn't done it, Curly would have done it and wouldn't have received any punishment either. So we've got, obviously, like I said, the justice system there that is extremely flawed and incredibly different to the one we see today. Slim obviously comes into the scene with Curly and the other men, and Slim seems to be, you know, the others don't really understand George's reaction. He's sitting on the floor, you know, just the same as they didn't understand Candy's reaction when Candy's dog got shot. You know, no one really acknowledged that the emotional impact that had on Candy, and it's exactly the same with George here, but Slim is the only one that does. He's the only one that understands. Once again, he's the voice of reason in the text. He says, never you mind, a guy got to sometimes. He totally understands why George did what he had to do. Did he have my gun and you got away from him and you took it and you killed him? So he's almost giving George a bit of a story there, and George just agrees, and then they go for a drink afterwards. And then this is a key quote for Slim at the end here: you had her, George, I swear you had her. So you had to, basically. Okay. You've got the developing friendship here as a theme between Slim and George. You know, Slim being again this person he can confide in, the one he can be himself with and trust. And again, you've got the text here, you've got the lives of these migrant workers. You know, very little friendships developed, and that's why they show real lack of understanding of why George might be impacted by this. You know, everyone other than Slim. And you've obviously got this reference to the justice system as well. The fact that, you know, Lennie might have had his gun and you took it away from him and then you took it upon yourself to kill him. Well, obviously that wouldn't be acceptable in today's, you know, modern society. And again, like I said earlier, it just shows how flawed the justice system was, that they were able to just go and kill a man and not be, you know, tried in court for it and so on. So what you can see on the screen there now is the last line in the novel, which goes to Carlson. George and Slim have just gone off now to get a drink, and Slim has said to George, you had to, George, you had to. And then Carlson and Curly look at them, you know, quite in a puzzling manner, completely confused, saying, you know, now what the hell do you suppose is eating them two guys? So, you know, as a reader, the irony of that sentence, you know, we know exactly what's upset George and what's upset Slim. He's just shot his best friend, and that's what's upset him. And the fact that the two men haven't got a clue, you know, they don't understand real friendship, emotion, and so on. It really is telling of you know, the way these kind of migrant workers lived their lives and how they conducted themselves. So Carlson really does represent your common migrant worker and how they reacted and how they behaved. You know, he's incredibly violent. He's the one that you know, shoots Candy's dog. He's the one that goes to get, you know, his gun, and obviously the gun's disappeared. George has taken the gun to shoot Lennie, and obviously Carlson is quite excitable about the fact that he's going to go and be participating in a lynching at the end of the novel. So he's quite a violent character. He's emotionless, you know, completely lacks any empathy with Candy when the shooting of the dog, and now with George, who's just shot his best friend. So, you know, these two men really don't understand what it is to have a true friendship on the ranches during this era, and they would represent your common migrant worker. This is how the men behaved during our era. So you've got this real kind of overt masculinity, this violence, this hostile nature, this threat of violence all the time on this ranch, and we see this underlying the entire text, which obviously resembles what was going on these ranches during the time. But obviously it's this kind of behaviour that leads to the frustration that these men must feel. And then obviously what you've got in the pictures is back to the life of the common migrant worker, which is what George has now got to accept that is ahead of him. You know, back-breaking work in the fields. You can see the amount of produce there and the crops that they're collecting for the rich landowners there. You can see how physical the work is, and then you can also see them, picture them in a brothel at the bottom. So this is the kind of life that George has now got ahead of him. And when he says what next there, well, nothing essentially, because nothing changes for them. Nothing is going to change for years to come. And this is what the reality of the life that is ahead for them, going from ranch to ranch in America during the 1930s.